I love you so much. Don't cause any trouble, my dear. Just like to hold him. Oh, he's so soft and sausage shaped. So you already know that I am a huge supporter of outlining your novel. So I wanted to speak today about one of the best tools I find for plotting your book. So I have used this tool for plotting my novel revision of North of the End. And basically all the things that really rocked about that draft and that I really liked, it kind of showed me why they were good. And all the bits that were a bit wobbly kind of showed me why they were wobbly. So I really got like a deeper understanding of my draft and what works and what doesn't, and that's really important. Kind of showed me my story in a whole new light, and that can only be a good thing. So the tool I'm talking about is Dan Harmon's Plot Embryo, and you might have already seen a diagram kind of illustrating it like this before. I am sure that I reblogged this graphic to my Tumblr kind of book blog thing like years ago, and it looks quite unassuming, but I actually found that when I grew to understand how it worked, it kind of blew my mind a wee bit. So Dan Harmon, if you didn't already know, is a writer, but he actually primarily writes for TV. So he created the show Community and Rick and Morty, which is an animated thing. I think there's also something called Harmontown. That might be a podcast, I'm not sure. Just like, by the way, if you haven't seen Community already, it's one of my favourite shows of all time, and like, you still have a chance to not make the biggest mistake of your life and go and watch it. It's very, very good. So basically what Dan Harmon did, because you know he was really interested in the story structure and how it worked and why it worked, he took Joseph Campbell's like monomyth theory and kind of distilled it into a bit of a simplified version, but basically an easy to use tool for plotting. So I'm going to start with kind of explaining a little bit about what the monomyth is and Joseph Campbell's chat. And then I'm going to ask, you know, should we be trying to emulate this structure? Is that something we should be doing? And then I'm going to go and explain how the plot embryo works and how to use it, or how I am using it. So Joseph Campbell, this guy, noticed a recurring pattern in all the mythology that he'd encountered. From this, he came up with a literary theory called the monomyth, or the hero's journey, which is the idea that all myths and most stories follow a similar, traditionally satisfying structure that is kind of cyclical. A hero goes on an adventure and then in a decisive crisis wins a victory and then returns home transformed or changed. So all of this is contained in Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and there was also a documentary on him called The Power of Myth, which might be a good place to start. I actually have not read this yet. I've had it for years. I actually studied it in comparative literature in university, and I still haven't finished it, but I'm returning to it in the wake of finding out about Dan Harmon's kind of version of the monomyth, because I would like to get, you know, like understand the source material. And I think there is a fair amount of stuff in this that's a bit out of date. You know, he was writing in 1949, so it's quite old, but I think there's still a lot of interesting stuff in there, so I'm going to read that. So should we try and emulate the monomyth structure if it exists? So Joseph Campbell, as far as I know, like I said, I haven't finished The Hero of 1,000 Faces, so correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand it, he didn't prescribe that, you know, this is how we should write stories. He was kind of just pointing at what we do have and saying this is how people do write stories. So this isn't like the one true way, you know, a story that doesn't follow this traditional monomyth structure isn't necessarily bad, but if that's the kind of story we want to tell a heroic story, then the monomyth is a really good place to start. A great book which kind of challenges the idea of the monomyth is Our Tragic Universe by Scarlett Thomas, which is one of my favourite books, even though I have a weird relationship with it. I kind of hate some parts of it, but like I also think it's very interesting. So it kind of explores the idea of stories that structurally break from the monomyth. So the idea is that when we map tragedies onto the structure of the monomyth, they're actually unfinished because they don't ever get round to that happy ending. Storyless stories kind of play with our expectations of what a story is, or what a story should be. There are lots of really great examples in this, and again, I recommend it. I think this kind of structure is just a good tool to have in your arsenal. Weapon to have in your arsenal, tool to have in your toolkit. I don't know if I'm going to want to write stories which don't fit this structure, which don't have heroes overcoming things, but I know that I want to write that now. I want it to be satisfying, I want it to click, and so the monomyth, like I said, is a really good place to start, so let's get into it. So, the plot embryo. I'm going to give you my summary of how it works here, but I definitely recommend going and checking out the original post by Dan and seeing how he explains it. There's also a video which I think is really good, which kind of adds some visual elements to that post, because in some ways this is a simple tool, but in some ways it actually takes a wee bit to get the hang of it, and I've just learned about it, so you know, I did as much reading as I could possibly find on it before I got started, and that was really useful. So I'd also recommend, you know, go to the source. I will link those below. So the plot embryo is a circle. It's divided in half horizontally and vertically, and these segments represent different things in the story universe. So the vertical line divides the internal change in the story, so the character. On the right you have stasis or ignorance, and on the left you have change or enlightenment. And these are going to be different depending on what story you're telling. Dan himself actually says in a lot of his plots in Community, these are dishonesty and honesty. The horizontal line divides external changes in the story, so the hero's world. On the top you have life, you have order, the familiar, and on the bottom you have death and chaos, disorder, and the unfamiliar. So these two lines give you kind of cardinal crossing points. If you're going clockwise, at number 3, you're going to cross from the familiar into the unfamiliar, kind of enter the story world. And at 5, you're going to cross from ignorant to enlightened. So the character is going to learn something, like, which is the point of the story. And then over at 7, you're going to cross from the unfamiliar back into the familiar. So you're going to return home. So each of these segments, once you add in your other 2 lines and you've divided into 8, is a plot point. So like I said, go and read Dan's explanation of each of these, because he goes into way more detail, but this is the kind of summary that I distilled from that, and I've got a little bit of a cheat sheet that I made for myself for reference for using this in future, and this is what I have. So number 1, you have a character in a zone of comfort, and you're establishing your protagonist here. At 2, you show that the character needs or wants something. They're in a zone of comfort, but something's not quite right. At number 3, they go off on their adventure. They go off to seek the thing they want. They cross from the threshold of, you know, the ordinary world into the story world. And that might be fantastical or not. Nevertheless, things are unfamiliar to them. So they have to leave the familiar to go and find this thing, whatever it is that they want. At number 4, they search for the thing. So they go through the road of trials, as it's called. They're forced to adapt to the unfamiliar. It's a kind of cleansing through fire, basically preparing them to get what they want. So at number 5, you've got find. They find the thing they want. Dan uses the same term as Joseph Campbell in this and calls it meeting the goddess. It's a moment of stillness and vulnerability and revelation. This is where they cross from ignorance into enlightenment, or they cross from whatever their initial state was to whatever they've now learned or how they've changed. They make a choice here, and then they start to ascend. At number 6, they take what they wanted. So they found it and now they take it, and they pay a high price for it. So this is where they meet their maker. It might be even called the all is lost moment. This is about sacrifice and cost. It's their low point. But the character has now changed. Instead of being reactive in the first segment of the circle, they're now active. So at 7, you have the return. So they cross from the unfamiliar back into the familiar. This might be, you know, a big car chase. They might be escaping, extracting, or it might be very low key. And then finally you have change. So the character has returned to the familiar, but they're now changed. You know, they now, having changed, have the power to change things. So they can change the status quo. They're now able to overcome their conflict, the thing they wanted and needed back in the beginning. Something that I thought was really interesting when I was working with this for, so I've distilled North of the End down to 3 main plots. Basically everything else, you know, like feeds into those. And so I'm doing a plot embryo for each of those. And for the first 2, I actually noticed there was a lot of symmetry between the kind of opposite ends of plot points. So I'm just going to go over kind of what they mean. And they actually kind of brought to light a lot of things and a lot of similarities and mirrorings and reversals that I hadn't noticed before. So the first opposite pair you've got is number 1 and number 5. So number 1, you've got a character who is comfortable in their ignorance. And then at number 5, you've got a character who is uncomfortable but becoming enlightened. At numbers 2 and 6, you have a character wanting something, and then you have the character getting what they wished for. and paying for it. At numbers 3 and 7, you have a character entering the unfamiliar as an ignorant person, and then you have them coming back to the familiar as an enlightened person. And then lastly, at points 4 and 8, you have a character who is being forced to adapt, maybe in some ways being punished for their ignorance. And then at 8, you have a character who has changed and is now using that to bring about good. I found these comparisons really helpful because I found there were points where maybe one side made perfect sense and then the other one, like, it maybe just needed tweaked, and then actually they perfectly kind of mirrored each other and it just all fit really nicely together. So I thought I would go over that because that's not something really I don't think that anyone touched on in any of the stuff I read. And lastly, I'm just going to go over a couple of practical tips for how to use this and how I've been using it so far. Like I said, I've only done a couple of these, but it's been really, really helpful. So the easiest way I found to set up a plot embryo on an A4 piece of paper is to draw a circle in the middle. You can freehand it doesn't need to look pretty. I'm a bit of a neat freak, so I like to draw around, you know, some sellotape or a jar or a mug or something and to get it quite even. So then you want to define your halves and quadrants. So what kind of change is the character going to undergo, and then what kind of difference do you have between the ordinary world and the story world? So is that a world of magic, or is it a new job? Something like that. What is the unfamiliar situation which the character is going to traverse, which is going to help them learn the thing they're going to learn? And then you set up these kind of radiating sections out from each of the plot points. So you've got space, you've got designated space to write about each of those plot points. I find that is the best way to do it. I did not do that the first time and it became a bit of a mess. After you've defined those, then you can start generating possible plot points for each of these sections. As you're looking at each one, you can refer back to, you know, the descriptions of what they are, and I would go in and do those in pen. And then for the rest of your working, you know, you're trying to figure out the plot points and things, I would do that in pencil, because, you know, nothing's set in stone here and you're probably going to tweak things as you figure out how they mirror each other, or maybe something's in the wrong place and actually needs to be somewhere else. So I'd start with pencil. So then you can start generating plot points to fit each of these sections. But you also just want to take a look at the circle itself and what point you're at, you know, like what boundary you're crossing, and make sure that the plot points kind of adhere to that. And just keep kind of moulding from there. If you're trying to plot a story that you've already written or you've already got plot points for, then it's a good idea to try and list all the plot points you've already got just on a separate piece of paper, and then go in and try and fit them into the structure and see exactly how that works. That's what I did for North of the End, and it was very effective, so I definitely recommend that. And that's about it. I hope you guys find this really helpful. Like I said, it's kind of changed a lot of things for my plotting. It's really kind of brought everything to light and sharpened it and made it better, so I hope it does that for you too. And I think that the more you see existing stories and you're able to break them down and see how they fit into the structure, the easier the plot embryo will be to use. There are already examples in that in the links below, but I think those kind of things are really useful, so if you have any breakdowns of some of your favourite stories, then please leave them in the comments below, because I think that would be good for a lot of people to see. Okay, that's it for today, guys. Take care of yourselves. As always, I'm Rachel Stephen, novelist, YouTuber, Woodland Hellbitch, and if you like this video, give it a like, because why not? And if you haven't subscribed already, maybe you should subscribe, because this is Brent, and just look at his little face. Look at his little Brent face. Why wouldn't you subscribe for more of that sweet content? Okay, and now it's bye-bye from me and Brent. I'll see you if... It's been a long day. Excuse me while I just tear off my dead skin. Oh darling, do you not have any water? Poor baby. Is this thing on? Yes it is. You can never be too sure. What am I doing?